The flashlight beam dies not because the battery is dead, but because something has swallowed the light itself. I stand in the basement of St. Jude's, clutching a yellowed floor plan that claims this corridor ends at the boiler room 50 feet away. Yet here, the concrete stretches into an infinite abyss, lined with hundreds of identical steel doors that hum with a low, mechanical vibration. My boots echo against the wet floor, each step sounding heavier than the last, as if gravity is increasing with every meter I walk. I check my map again, desperate for orientation, but the ink on the paper is fading, the lines redrawing themselves to show more doors deeper into the dark. There are no windows, no vents, no logical exit, only the endless repetition of rusted handles and peeling paint. I try to turn back, but the path behind me has vanished, replaced by yet another row of identical doors stretching into the void. The air grows cold and thick with the scent of antiseptic and old blood, pressing against my lungs like a physical weight. I realize with dawning horror that these are not rooms for patients, but cells for something else entirely. The humming stops abruptly, leaving a silence so profound it rings in my ears. One by one, the doors begin to creak open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. I drop the floor plan, watching it crumple into a useless ball of paper on the ground. The last thing I see before the door behind me slams shut is the map's new legend: "You are now room 402. The blueprint for the 43rd floor was not an error, but an invitation I couldn't refuse. I stood in my office on the 42nd level, listening to the rhythmic clatter of keys against plastic that should have been impossible. There was no concrete above me, only the hollow sky and the steel beams holding up nothingness. Yet the typing grew louder, a frantic staccato echoing from a space where air alone should reside. I checked the structural plans again, tracing the lines until my eyes burned, confirming the void between my ceiling and the roof. My colleagues complained of headaches and the smell of ozone, but they kept their heads down, afraid to look up at the acoustic tiles. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed through the maintenance hatch, stepping into the dark gap where the 43rd floor ought to be. The air was cold and smelled of fresh ink and wet paper, clinging to my skin like a second layer. In the center of the empty expanse, a single desk sat illuminated by a ghostly blue glow. No one was sitting there, but the keys on the keyboard continued to depress in a perfect, relentless rhythm. I reached out to touch the screen, realizing too late that the document open before me was the original architectural draft for this very building. The cursor blinked, waiting for my input, as the first line of text began to rewrite itself with my name. The smell of stale perfume and dust was usually enough to make me gag, but tonight it smelled like wet earth and old blood. I had been mopping the linoleum in the abandoned department store for 6 months, learning the rhythm of the shadows that danced when the fluorescents flickered. It started small, just a hand turned slightly toward the exit or a head tilted at an unnatural angle. I blamed my fatigue, chalking it up to the long shifts and the caffeine jittering through my veins. But last Tuesday I caught the reflection in the glass display case shifting before my own eyes could track it. The mannequin had moved 3 feet closer to me while I was looking directly at its plastic face. Panic set in as I realized they weren't just moving, they were hunting. I began covering every mirror with black trash bags, terrified of what might step out of the reflection into reality. Tonight I decided to stay perfectly still, staring hard at the central display to prove it was all in my mind. I held my breath until my lungs burned, refusing to blink, refusing to look away from its painted smile. Slowly, agonizingly, its head began to rotate toward me while I maintained unbroken eye contact. It didn't move when I looked at it. It moved because it knew I was finally seeing it clearly for the first time. The floor beneath my feet turned soft and warm, like flesh giving way under pressure. I tried to scream, but my jaw had fused shut, stiffening into a permanent plastic grin. The brakes screeched against rusted rails, halting at a station that officially ceased to exist 3 decades ago. I stared through the grimy windshield at Platform 4, expecting only shadows and silence in the abandoned district. Yet a figure stepped onto the tracks, dressed in the faded polyester uniform of a transit worker from 1994. My hands trembled on the controls as the heavy doors slid open with a reluctant hiss. He boarded without looking up, his face hidden beneath a cap pulled low over eyes that hadn't blinked in years. The air inside the car grew instantly frigid, smelling of stale tobacco and wet concrete from a past era. I slammed the door shut, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. He sat directly opposite me, placing a paper bag on his lap that leaked dark, viscous fluid onto the plastic seat. I tried to speak to demand he leave, but my voice died in my throat alongside any hope of escape. The train lurched forward into the tunnel, carrying us both away from the world above and deeper into the earth's hollow veins. He finally looked up, revealing a face that was smooth, unlined, and terrifyingly familiar. It was my own reflection, preserved in the amber of that night when I first drove this route. We are not traveling to the end of the line, we are circling back to the beginning. The vent didn't just hum, it sang my mother's lullaby in a voice that hadn't existed for 30 years before I drew breath. I froze, my flashlight beam trembling against the rusted steel grates of Sector 4, convinced my grief had finally fractured my sanity. The tune was perfect, every minor key shift and gentle crescendo matching the grainy recording I'd played obsessively since childhood. But this wasn't a playback from an old tape. It was fresh air pushing through dust-choked ducts, carrying the scent of lavender and damp earth. I pressed my ear to the cold metal, tears blurring my vision as the melody swelled with impossible warmth. How could a machine mimic the specific, broken cadence of her voice so precisely? The song drifted lower, slowing into a rhythmic pulse that matched the thrumming of my own terrified heart. I tried to pull away, but the air around me grew heavy, thick with an expectation I couldn't name. A whisper seemed to brush against my neck, not from the vent, but from the shadows pooling in the corner behind me. The lullaby reached its final, lingering note, hanging in the stagnant air like a question waiting for an answer. I realized then that the bunker wasn't decommissioned because it was empty. It was sealed to keep something in. The humming stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of wet footsteps approaching from the darkness where my mother had told me she waited. The red light of the darkroom hummed like a dying insect as I pulled the first print from the developing tray. It showed my own car parked crookedly in the rusted lot of that abandoned amusement park, the roller coaster skeleton looming behind me like broken ribs. I frowned, remembering how alone I had been when I slept off the exhaustion after shooting the decaying rides. But there in the passenger seat sat a figure with its head tilted back against the window, eyes wide and unblinking. The face was obscured by shadow, but the posture screamed of unnatural stillness, as if it were not breathing but waiting. I grabbed the next print, my hands trembling, expecting another angle of the empty park or perhaps a glitch in the film emulsion. Instead, the second image showed the same figure from inside the car, looking directly into the lens with a smile that stretched too far across its pale features. The third photo revealed the interior dashboard clock, frozen at 3:17 a.m., a time I knew for certain I had never been awake during my trip. A cold sweat prickled on my neck as I realized the figure wasn't just sitting there. It was leaning forward, one hand resting gently on my shoulder in every subsequent frame. The final print showed the rearview mirror, reflecting not the empty road behind me, but the back of my own head as I slept soundly in the driver's seat. I dropped the wet paper into the fixer bath, watching the image dissolve into white nothingness, but the feeling of weight on my shoulder remained heavy and cold. I turned off the darkroom light, plunging the room into silence, and listened to the faint sound of breathing that wasn't mine coming from the corner of the small space. The dust didn't look like it had been walked on, it looked like it had been erased. I swept my flashlight beam across the grand stage of the abandoned Orpheum, expecting to see the usual debris of decades, but the floor was pristine except for a single trail. The prints were small, delicate, and led directly from the wings toward the proscenium arch. They stopped 3 feet above the ground, hovering in empty space with impossible clarity. I dropped my keys, the metallic clatter echoing too loudly in the suffocating silence. My breath hitched as I realized the footprints weren't pressing down, they were pulling up. The air around the suspended steps shimmered, distorting the light like heat rising off asphalt. I tried to back away, but my boots felt heavy, glued to the spot by a sudden, crushing pressure in my chest. A cold draft swept through the theater, carrying the faint scent of old perfume and rotting velvet. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into a darkness that felt thick and alive. I waited for my eyes to adjust, for the safety of memory or reason to return, but nothing came. Instead, I heard the soft, wet sound of something landing gently on the stage floor behind me. I turned slowly, realizing with horror that I wasn't looking at footprints in the dust, but at the space where my own shadow had just vanished.